En mi español es insuficiente por precisión. So I will present these ideas in English, if that is okay. But thank you for being here this morning, early on our last day at the third annual conference. It was proposed that I introduce some basic ideas, concepts, and experiences that are part of the program for a new biocultural ethic. So without further ado, I'll begin. I'll give a quick overview of what we hope to accomplish, first in part by diagnosing the problem or the challenge that we face, to create a new ethical orientation in order to address the changing climate of our global world. And that involves rethinking or reconceptualizing, for which we have some tools, and then we have some basic experiences. But just a quick idea of what we'll do, and I'll try and speak as slowly as I can, but if I go too fast, please let me know. Part of the challenges that we face is the current model by which we think when we face global climate change efforts. Part of what we do at the academic universities or institutions is to try and educate, but we have a, let us say, reformulated model for what education looks like. As a professor of philosophy, as someone that takes education seriously, I like to go back ever so slightly to the etymology of education, to the Latin, which is educere, educere being the word for to lead, but the E is the prefix in question. It means, at least in Latin, both from as well as to. And so I envision education as a journey from ourselves out into the world and then back into ourselves. Right? We start with a somewhat self-oriented vision, but then we have to learn further about the world in which we find ourselves, but then that leads back to a reformulation or a re-envisioning of how we interact with the world in which we find ourselves. Through the course of the conference, we've seen a number of themes, and so I thought I might summarize ever so slightly, is that for many of us, this has been a personal journey, but we also realize that our personal journeys are a part of a larger socio-historical journey. And so I can educate or become educated myself, wherein I learn about myself, my world, and then reimagine how I find myself in my world. But we also have to re-envision how we do so as communities, as local communities, as state communities, as federal communities, and maybe even possibly as a world community. Okay? And so we want to return to nature, that is to re-find ourselves in the world and have an ethical orientation, one that is both sustainable and can celebrate the values of biodiversity as well as cultural diversity. One small distinction that I think emphasizes this leading from, out into, and then back to ourselves is the concept of how we find ourselves in the world today. One can imagine that, say, 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, that humanity itself was operating a level of survival. But given the world of plenty in which we find ourselves today, survival isn't the singular way or the singular mode that we want to orient towards our world. Right? So I suggest here that one of the challenges that we face is that we're not merely surviving in our world, but we are, and this is a theme that has appeared throughout the conferences, we're trying to live well inside our world. One of our keynote addresses described this as flourishing for both human beings, but also other than human beings. Animals in particular was a focus for many of the discussions yesterday. Right? Part of our systematic approach, or our biocultural ethical approach, takes its cues from the works of Alva Leopold. And one primary idea that we find in Leopold is an expanding circle of moral consideration. He suggests that 2,000 years ago, or perhaps longer, that we were primarily interested in white, male, land-owning citizens, and those were the only people that had moral consideration. And in the mythos that he tells, we slowly expand from just simply a singular group of people to all people, to all organisms, both human as well as other than human, and Aldo Leopold emphasizes that the time has arrived that we need to expand moral consideration to not just organisms, but also land. Right? Aldo Leopold famously coined the term a land ethic. And so it's a systematic and a broad and expansive way to try and understand, once again, ourselves, a personal journey, people other than ourselves, our fellow human beings, right? Other organisms within our world, right? Other than human beings, but now also the space that we occupy, the land that we live in. Okay? The chief challenges that we face is this distinction between surviving in our world, trying to find the necessities that we have in order to live, and flourishing, that is, living well. Right? I like to imagine that this is the difference between using or perhaps exploiting the world, understanding and comprehending the world as resources for our utilization, right? And appreciating and co-inhabiting the world, that is, living well, hoping, working towards our own flourishing, our own self-fulfillment, our own self-actualization, as well as the actualization of others. I also envision this as a socio-historical movement, much like Aldo Leopold does, moving from an egocentric concern, that is a personal or self-centered way of thinking, to an anthropocentric concern. This is part of the predominant discourse that we find today. Worrying only or exclusively about humans or human interests. One of the movements that we find that is burgeoning now is a biocentric concern, that is, all living organisms are worthy of moral consideration. However, I find this to be middle of our development, that if we go from an egocentric concern to an anthropocentric concern to a biocentric concern, the next phase in our development or our considerations would be an ecocentric concern. Not just living organisms, but also the land, the minerals, the rocks, the systems in which we find ourselves. Further development that I can envision is a cosmocentric concern, that we're worried not just about the Earth itself, but maybe the place in which we find the Earth in a larger system. And so ever-expanding concentric circles of consideration or moral considerability. And the last development that I envision is an ontologocentric, that is, we are now concerned about the nature as well as the consideration of all beings. This could include humans, of course, obviously, other living organisms, the land in which we find ourselves, the planet on which we find ourselves, the place in the system that we find our planet, but now also, perhaps tying in with my colleague's discussion, transcendent beings or immanent beings that we have difficulty articulating. This would be the broadest and most expansive way of trying to deliberate how we work, how we interact, and how we depend on one another. One of the mantras for environmental movements that we found in the last 3 decades is that we need to raise the level of awareness. That we need to be informed and aware for moral consideration about other than human organisms. One of the things that we've noticed over the last decade or two is that simply making people aware of other than human activities, that is biodiversity, right, is insufficient. And so field environmental philosophy has decided to extend away from or beyond merely awareness to what I've decided is something like growth. We need to grow and expand our conceptual tools such that we can create experiences that will not just simply make people aware, say by watching a documentary or reading a textbook, but have concrete experiences that then transform how people understand and how people interact with themselves, their fellow human beings, other than human entities and beings, as well as the land in which they find themselves. So how do we grow? Is one question that I've posed. Our answer is we grow by initiating and introducing others to these transformative experiences. One of the ideas that we've seen throughout the theme of these conferences is that we have work operating through much of academia at a conceptual level. That is, philosophers, theologians, even biologists think about and describe conceptually all of the different entities that we find. Right? But simple awareness at the conceptual level is insufficient. Right? Field environmental philosophy actively works to promote a kind of emotive engagement with the environment and other than human organisms as well. And so I envision that what field environmental philosophy does is it changes our lenses, provides us new concepts on one hand, new ways of comprehending, new ways of understanding, but also providing opportunities for concrete, active experiences that then resonate with us at a level of feeling or sentiment or emotion. And by combining both actions with understanding, that can lead to a transformative experience, an experience that will then reshape, that is, change the way that we see and change the way that we operate within our world. Now, how do we grow? Transformative experience is the short answer. That is, in fact, the goal, to create opportunities for transformative experiences. Right? We need to shift and change from an anthropocentric, that is an Anthropocene way of living, and two, I'd say, dominant challenges, or two primary challenges that we face are what I'm describing here as a hegemonic dominant ideology. That is an economic lens by which we view all things as resources for human consumption. Okay. Coupled with this economic lens, we find ourselves in the midst of biocultural homogenization. Euro-phallocentric lens, that is a lens by which we view things through specific languages, through specific cultural ideologies, and through certain gendered ways of approaching the world. This has been the dominant discourse for the past 2,000 years, as we can best estimate. Some of the things that we've seen from this conference also resonated with changing or transforming the ways that we see away from this older model, an economic model, a European model, a North American model, and that is embracing other possible views by which we can provide an interdisciplinary and intercultural engagement. Now, what I understand our challenges to be elicit a couple of needs. I've mentioned two of them, but one of them, and I think the singular and most important one, is that we need a new vision. We need a new lens by which we view and understand our world. That is, we need to have a picture. I often joke with people that philosophers don't do much, but we do one thing and we do one thing fairly well, and that is that we tell stories and we paint pictures, mental pictures. And this is precisely what field environmental philosophy has provided for us. A new picture, a new way, a new lens, one that synthesizes biological as well as cultural interactions in the formation for research experiences that can then have this transformative experience. Another theme that we've seen throughout the course of the conference is the notion of conceptual tools. So I want to embrace the notion of Homo sapiens, that is the knowing or understanding human being, as well as what I'm describing here as Homo faber, that is the making and creating. Field environmental philosophy actively works to create both experiences as well as new concepts by which we can, in fact, view the world. So I envision, and I think that field environmental philosophy envisions, that biocultural ethics is a creative activity, one that makes a new vision, a new way of seeing, as well as providing us with the tools to do so. And the remainder of my presentation is really to try and explain a few of these tools by which we re-envision or reframe the way we understand ourselves in the world as well as in the larger picture. I'll run through some of these slides fairly quickly for the purposes of time, but I hope that it's clear, and you can always ask me for the clarification later. This is a complicated diagram. I'm going to decompose it here into smaller parts. But this is a central thematic that we find in field environmental philosophy, or FEP. Notice bioculture as it stands at the center of all of these integrated and integrating conceptual levels at different scalar levels. That is, we can work at some more basic, more experiential concepts. We can then reach out to more discursive concepts, and then we can move into systems of knowledge and ways of knowing. I'll break this down into a more simplistic picture, and then I'll return to this overarching view in just a moment. Okay. One of the most basic conceptual tools we're describing as ontological tools are ways of being in the world. And that is the way that we understand ourselves as beings as well as other than human beings. The 3 H's that FEP promotes as a conceptual tool to reformulate, right, is constituted by the intersection of the habits that we have in the spaces that we have them, the habitats, and then reformulating and understanding not merely ourselves, but all of the other inhabitants that occupy that space. Here, these images are actually borrowed from a student of ours from an exercise that we have during one of our courses, that the habitat, as it turns out, is his home. And one of the things that he does, or some of the habits that he engages in the top right corner, comedically, are going through the ordinary activities of life. Going to work, driving to work, being at home, looking outside, being somewhat of a sad fish. But these are ordinary activities, and these are the habits that we embody. When we are at home, we may engage with our fellow human beings, but we also engage with, in significant and meaningful ways, other occupants of our space, and that is our co-inhabitants. We can see them as other organisms, or even potentially landscape features, right, that participate in the habits of our habitat. The way that you engage with pets, the way that you engage with outside space, the way that you engage with gardens, right, are all part of our experience. And the significance here is that we want to view these co-inhabitants not merely as objects that we find for our utilization or use, that would be an older model, but to envision them as subjects of experience as well, who have their own subjective experience that are worth consideration and moral considerability. At the next scalar level, that is going outward, we have what I'm describing as discursive tools. We find an engagement of the biophysical with the symbolic and linguistic, as well as with the institutions that operate at socio and political levels. Right? And these intersections between the physical world in which we find ourselves, the ways that we describe ourselves, and then the institutions that we develop that are dependent upon the biophysical, as well as the ways and the languages that we use, provide another conceptual intersection that we need to be made aware of and that we need to develop conscientiously, that is moving forward with purpose. At the furthermost level, or what I call epistemological tools, is to recognize that there are more than one mode, that is more than one European or perhaps North American way of seeing things. Right? And so field environmental philosophy attempts to incorporate different wisdom traditions, or different knowledge traditions that we find throughout the world. From the philosophical perspective, we hope to incorporate less well-represented disciplines or modes of philosophy, that is pre-Socratic or underrepresented or marginalized Western philosophies. From non-Western traditions, we embrace Amerindian and indigenous knowledge systems. And we also want to incorporate contemporary scientific exploration models, that is, our contemporary ecological sciences. Now, I'm going to zoom back out to the larger picture. Notice that if we engage with the biophysical at a linguistic level, that is, implementing them and providing institutions that can then recognize the spaces that we occupy, the beings that occupy that space, and the way that we occupy that space, that now also include other traditions, other ways of seeing and viewing the world. We can create an ethical system that will celebrate and promote biodiversity, cultural diversity, biocultural diversity, that is, respecting and promoting all of the many different organisms and ways of seeing the world. Now, these are merely the conceptual tools that field environmental philosophy has developed over the years. This is one half of the formula. Now, I only have really one more slide. It is a complicated slide, but it is the methodology that we've developed over the last 20 years to provide activities that we can then use with these conceptual tools to engage with students, fellow researchers, politicians, academics, common people that come to visit different locations where we have our research activities, such that it can then provide a supplementary or secondary engagement that is the active or motive engagement, that can then truly affect a transformative experience. Right? So last slide, bear with me just a little bit longer. Right? Very complicated, but it is easily understood in terms of 4 steps. Right? The first step that field environmental philosophy promotes is interdisciplinary research. Right? That is, we take not just a singular field and pursue research expeditions, but we bring together various disciplines, often philosophers, with ecologists, with ornithologists, with bryologists, with anthropologists, with theologists. And it is by the intersection of these different disciplines that we then reframe how we will constitute our research activities. So our research itself is informed not by a singular vision, perhaps an economic or exploitative vision, right? But a vision that can celebrate these diverse cultural intersections. Once the research is conducted, one of the difficulties that we've encountered is how to communicate that information effectively. Right? Non-scientific people, right, don't read scientific manuals, technical scientific essays well. So field environmental philosophy wants to encourage communications of these research findings through symbolic and metaphorical language. Right? Simple, easy to understand, but very emotive, very emotion-laden language that can help express and communicate. It's not to oversimplify the messaging that we find in scientific or interdisciplinary research, but it is to capture our audience and to motivate them to engage with the research that is found. Once we have our research, once we have our effective metaphorical communication, we then encourage participants to create a type of activity that will be both educational as well as ethical in nature. And these activities can range from a number of different things, from simple games that we play with children, that once again have an educational but also ethical component, to conservation efforts, to field excursions, to visiting different places, right, to engaging with. Right? I'll provide an example in just a minute. Right? And the last step that we have, step 4, is to promote in situ conservation. Right? That is conservation in the areas that we find our research being conducted. Right? In those places that it's warranted, and we have both institutional power to do so. Right? We want to provide as much conservation space as we possibly can so that we can then promote more research activities. Right? And the research activities themselves are going to have ethical and educational implications as well. One quick example that we find in the Mora Park down in Puerto Williams is what we call underwater with a hand lens. Right? It is a research engagement wherein we're documenting microscopic organisms that we find in the Robalo River. Right? Part of the way that the research is engaged in is by actually removing some of the insects from the river and documenting both the age, population, density, as well as the health of the river. But one of the emphases that our primary researcher, Tamara Contador, has emphasized is that rather than just simply removing the creatures from the water, killing them and taking them back to the lab, is that we can document either via photography or by visual observation and replace the organisms back in the river. So science doesn't need to kill. Science can conduct its research in an ethical way. We created this metaphor underwater with a hand lens to emphasize the changing lenses for the transformation that we need to have about our relationship with the world, that is about cultural ethics. Right? And it has in fact created, or at least has been a part of the creation of the Omora Park, that is our in situ conservation, as well as our Cape Horn Biosphere Conservation Preserve. Right? And so we find in the activities in Puerto Williams, with Omora Park, with the Biosphere Conservation, all of our 4 steps actually engaged. And one of the promising notes that we have is that when we take both researchers as well as students, and we do engage in these activities, that is, we conduct the research with our ecological and biological researchers, our students have a profound understanding and their lives are in fact changed. And so we find it to be successful to engage at the level of conceptual revitalization, that is a reorientation and a changing of our mental lenses, as well as engaging with them in these activities that then give them a face-to-face encounter with other subjects of nature, other than human beings, and then they move forward and plan to and respect and reorient themselves in the way in which they find themselves.